For the past couple of months, I've had to keep this particular project a secret, which has been no easy feat, as these soap dishes have taken up an extraordinary amount of space in my workshop, and I've had to be filming around them constantly. Now though, I can finally share it with you, and I'll be taking you through the entire process, beginning with clay I've prepared specially for this project that's almost absurdly soft. I couldn't easily make vases or bowls with this stuff, but simple flat discs of clay, well, that's easy. Anyway, before I get too bogged down with the process itself, I should explain this project a bit more thoroughly. For a very long time, since I was an apprentice, in fact, a well-known cook in the UK called Nigel Slater has been a collector of my work, which I've always been really grateful for, especially when I was a younger, budding potter. As the years have gone by, we've spoken about doing a potential project together, and at the beginning of this year, that finally came to fruition. But I'm not making pots for food. Rather, Nigel Slater is doing a collaboration with a perfumery brand called Perfumer H. I'll be leaving links to everything, by the way, in the description below. Anyway, Nigel asked me to create the soap dishes for this collection, which he and Lyn Harris, the founder of Perfumer H, have developed a bar of soap specially for, and thus that's where this project starts. The idea was to create something really simple, but I was given quite free rein to develop the shape and to use the glaze I'd like. I don't generally do wholesale work like this, as the pots I create always have to be very much within my style. I don't venture out and make things that aren't aligned with my brand or aesthetic. And so my aim was to create a really sleek, slender soap dish that had crisp, sharp lines on top and a very simple green glaze, which just so happens to be the mossy green glaze you've seen me use quite a lot lately. They start from pound lumps of clay, some 454 grams, measured to plus or minus 10 of that to make weighing out quicker. Now, these objects will ultimately be rectangular, and it is perhaps a bit unusual to throw something that's round, if the intention is for it to be square. But I figured as I don't really have much experience slip casting or hand building, I'd just throw the things, as that is something I can do quickly, especially with soft clay. This also meant I could throw them and then trim them to have a really concave surface, and it's this that ultimately gave the soap dishes their final, actually rather complex shape that really tested me in the long run. It wasn't ultimately the making of them that was tricky, but it was the drying, the glazing, the beveling of the edges, and the endless repetitive tasks. And whilst it was relatively hard work making about 270 of these, I actually enjoy the hard work. I enjoy making something over and over again, as I think in many cases that's really what it takes to master it, to honestly learn a particular shape and to become wickedly efficient. So, I'm going to be making each of these on a bat. This way I can just throw a simple flat disc, roughly tidy it up, and then lift it away and set it aside. I won't wire it through at this stage, and really all I'm concerned about is throwing them to have a slightly concave surface and for their rims to hit the rubber pointer which you can see on the right. This way I know that each one is exactly the same as the last. And as they are such simple things, it doesn't matter if they are left rough at this stage, with messy lines or edges, as all of that can be tidied up in seconds at the trimming stage, and I'd rather just get the throwing itself over and done with, as it's the throwing of these that ended up being the greatest bottleneck. Firstly, I only had about 60 of these bats or so it's this that dictated how many I could make at any one time, but more than that was simply how much space these discs took up in the workshop. It was really a battle of space more than anything, and as I made these in the summer, I was sort of constantly racing to finish them before they dried out too much, which meant it was sort of a good thing that I could only make 60 at a time, as trying to manage, say, 150 of these at any one time would have been a real pain. After a short bit of practice, I was able to throw each of these in about a minute and 10 seconds. So again, the throwing of these was sort of the easiest part. There's no height in these vessels, they're simply a flat disc, made with incredibly soft clay, which meant centering the lump and forcing it down into a disc like this was practically effortless. The bat is given a bit of a clean, the throwing gauge's pointer is lifted up and out of the way, and the dish is lifted away. 269 left to go. We agreed on about 250 soap dishes overall, and so the reason I'm making 270 is to ensure that there are enough extras to account for things like breakage or misfires, and well, all kinds of things that can happen along the way when making pottery. When making to order like this, you do sort of always have to overproduce, as if you were commissioned to make, say, 50 mugs, and you make exactly 50. If anything goes wrong along the way, you have to go all the way back to the start and make more. And obviously that becomes increasingly stressful the closer you get to your deadline, so it's better to overproduce initially, so further down the line you aren't screwed over. The flat floor felt like the best place to store these, as I'm hoping I can leave them down here, partly covered overnight, to dry out. So here's the first lot of dishes, thrown quickly, and they'll be left overnight to turn leather hard, whereupon they can be wired off the backs, flipped over, dried further, trimmed, and then cut into shape. And if there's one thing I want this video to get across, it's just how much repetition there is. So, to wire these off, I place the bat and the dish on the table, brace them against my knee, and then slide a very thin, sharp wire underneath them. There's a chance this can cause the dish to warp slightly, so if I notice one is slightly deformed, I place it on the wooden tabletop and then press it down from on top, flattening it again. Surprisingly, this was the single task I looked forward to least, as having that wire gouge into your fingertips 250 times really wasn't very enjoyable. And if I were to do this again, I think I would create some sort of wired harp and a jig the bat could slide into just to make this step somewhat easier. Generally speaking, they were mostly leather hard by morning, and all I'd do is simply stack those that were ready next to my wheel ready for trimming, whereas those that needed more time to dry out I'd leave on the tabletop like this, as the wood itself would draw moisture out of them, drying them rather quickly, especially in this hot weather. All the scraps were then thrown into my reclaim to be recycled, and then, whilst the wiring off was probably my least favourite part, the scraping of the bats, well, that's got to be everybody's favourite. All of these scraps that are removed can very easily be recycled. Clay can in fact be recycled up until the first firing, after which the material can still actually be used, but it has to be ground up into a fine powder that you can add back to the clay, which is something called grog. It strengthens clay bodies and makes them less prone to warping or cracking as they dry and fire. I did eventually switch to a larger scraper, but even doing this you have to be careful, as it's easier than you'd think for the scraper's edge to simply collide with your thumb, especially if you aren't really paying attention. Then, to compress them again, as they do have a tendency to bow upward, I place a really heavy bucket of glaze on top of them and leave them like this overnight to flatten. And the scraps are immediately placed into a bucket of water, and as they're so thin they'll quickly degrade and turn into a slurry. The next step is trimming them and cutting them to shape, but before I do that I have to prepare a surface where the flat soap dishes can be placed onto. The key when making flatware like this, or tiles, or things like dinner plates, is to dry them out slowly, so all of these will be going on plastic lined surfaces, which I can then wrap up. And before embarking on this project, I made a very quick cardboard mock-up of the soap and the dish at the finished stage. Essentially, the soap dish is just a scaled up version of the soap, in terms of its length and width anyway. And so from this point, I can simply scale up the bottom version by 12% to account for the shrinkage of the clay. That's what this is, and so I should be able to use the largest piece of cardboard as a template, which I'll place in the middle of the trimmed disc before cutting around it. It's not the best tool, and I know it's only cardboard, but it should definitely last for this project. I used these bits of clay initially to pin the form down, but I very quickly realised that I don't actually need them, as the disc is so low and wide and relatively heavy, and it will hold itself in place with just a light bit of pressure from on top. So eliminating the need to do that saved a few precious seconds on each piece. At the same time, it doesn't truly matter if the piece is completely centred or not, as I'm going to be cutting away so much of the shape. You'll never notice if it has been trimmed slightly off centre, but I am talking millimetres here, not centimetres or inches. I begin by trimming the top to have a lovely curve to it, and burnish it smooth with a metal kidney. It's then flipped, upside down, centred, and all I need to do for the bottom is to trim it flat and again simply smooth it over with a kidney. This step takes seconds. It's then stamped with my maker's mark, which does cause some of the clay on the other side to bow outward, but this is easy to fix. I simply flip it back over onto a wooden bat. Here's that small bulge I was talking about, which I can simply scrape away. It doesn't need much. The dish can then be centred again and burnished, hiding that tiny indentation. And now we get to the exciting part, which is placing the template on the dish, which I've measured and thrown wide enough so that no corner of the template extends over the edge of the disc, otherwise the cut corner wouldn't be particularly neat. I then use a much larger scraper, which I hold tightly with two hands and then push it firmly down through the clay. The stoneware has to be in the perfect condition for this to work best, and it took me a bit of time to figure that out. It really wants to be on the firm side of leather hard, but if it's too hard you need to use too much pressure with the tool, and that can cause crumbly, messy cuts. But when you hit that sweet spot, it leaves tremendously flush, smooth sides where the blade has passed, and the curved line that's left on top is also wonderfully crisp. If anything, it's slightly too sharp, so I imagine at some point I'm going to have to soften them ever so slightly. The wood works better as a surface to cut them on, as the clay doesn't stick to it quite so much as I think it would the metal. Plus, I don't want to slam the blade of the scraper into the aluminium wheel head, as it would probably scratch it. And the nice thing about throwing them and trimming them like this is that I get these lovely curves on each side. I then place them down really delicately on the plastic lime board, trying my absolute best to not bend them at all, as warping really is going to be the biggest issue with these. Drying tiles is notoriously difficult, and that's essentially what these are, so I'm going to dry them flat, dry them slow, and constantly check them. As I cut, I make sure not to push down too firmly on the cardboard, as I don't want it to compress the nice sharp edge on top. At times it's just pinned in place lightly, so it doesn't lose its position, but at the same time I don't mind if it wanders off by a millimetre or so, as these are all handmade objects, so a small amount of variance here and there really doesn't bother me. And whilst I know I say things like that, at the same time I love the challenge of making things en masse like this that are just identical. It's a test, and one I relish. And as I haven't really made anything like this for a long time, despite it being highly repetitive and sometimes monotonous, I always found the process enjoyable to some degree. As for the scraps, well, as soon as I realised that one wooden board like this wouldn't be enough, I very quickly just started to throw them onto the floor, ending up with a massive heaped pile, which I left there, lazily perhaps, letting them turn bone dry in place before simply dunking them all in my reclaimed bucket. Now, the first issue I encountered was this scruffy edge on the bottom. I could spend time carefully chamfering this edge on all 270 pieces at the leather hard stage, but I think I have a better idea, but more on that later. As for the scraper I'm using, this is just a dead cheap plasterer's scraper, and I found that I did have to sharpen the edge a couple of times, which I simply did with a diamond pad. Clay is so abrasive that after doing this say 500 times, the edge does become somewhat dull, and it was more difficult to initiate the cut, or rather I had to use much more force, which generally meant I had less control. So, the sharper the better, and stoneware slightly on the firm side of leather hard. That was the key to getting these as crisp as I wanted. The maker's marks are in different positions on the bottoms of each, which I quite like, as it adds some variance. Otherwise, they are all practically identical, save for a few scratches and bumps here and there, which I'm hoping the glaze that coats these will interact nicely with. I could fit about 9 to a board, which I would then very carefully wrap up with plastic. And I say carefully, as there were a couple of times where I yanked the plastic a bit too firmly, causing a number of the dishes and their crisp edges to collide, ruining them. But once wrapped, I would store these away and leave them for days on end, weeks even in some cases, as I got on with other projects. I've always been told that with flatware, it's best to just let it dry really slowly beneath plastic. This way no air can get in and dry it unevenly from one side, as it's this which can cause them to warp. To get the plastic sitting really flatly on this surface, I'd first sponge them over with water and then press the plastic sheeting down against it, causing the two to stick together, and ensuring there were no plastic lumps or lines that would push up and embed themselves into the relatively soft clay. The thing I like about making so many of the same things is the routine you end up getting into. You get faster. You learn when certain things need to be done. You begin to easily identify when the clay is in the right condition when the tools are in the right state, and all of the skills learned through production like this are transferable into other pots and projects. You simply don't learn the same things if you only make 1 or 2 of something, but make 270 of them, and you learn enough to write a chapter in a book. The one thing I'm not showing you at this stage, and it's something I forgot to film, is how I very softly ran a wetted finger over the 4 sharp lines on the top, just to make sure they weren't razor sharp. As for the bottoms of the tiles, well, I'm going to ignore them for now. I'll even bisquefy them in this messy state, as with the clay being so fragile and crumbly at this point, beveling the bottom edges and cleaning them at this stage might be more trouble than it's worth. So instead, this is something I'm going to do after I've biscuit-fired them to 1000 degrees Celsius. A week or 2 later, after they've all turned completely bone dry, which, by the way, is something I allowed them to do very carefully. Every other day, I would unwrap a board of them and check that they hadn't warped, which I'd do by gently pressing on them and seeing if they teetered, and if they did, I'd push them down with my thumbs and lean all of my upper body weight onto them, flattening them again. And when loading them into the kiln, I stack them vertically like this, as, supposedly with flatware, there's less chance the vessels will warp and crack. And to be honest, the last thing I'd want to do with these is actually stack them one on top of the other, as the sharp edges are just so prone to chipping or cracking. So they're placed in delicately, and then I very gently lay one against the other. This really was the stage where I thought I would damage something, or perhaps one of the stacks would fall over like dominoes, but surprisingly nothing happened. I didn't even chip one of them, or at least I didn't notice if I did. And with the electric kiln full, the lid can be closed, and the programmed firing to 1000 degrees can be activated. Electric kilns like this are automatic. You can fire them overnight when tariffs are cheaper, all with the simple press of a few buttons. The kiln reaches top temperature in the night, but then takes about a day and a half to cool down enough until it can be unpacked. This process of bisque firing pots changes the clay into ceramic. It both hardens the material and makes it porous. They're almost like little sponges, and if dunked in water, they really do absorb rather a lot, which is really important for the glazing process itself, as the glaze that these will ultimately be dipped into is pretty much a combination of water and all the raw materials, the minerals, the oxides, fluxes, and so on. These all come in powdered form and are mixed thoroughly into the water, and when these absorbent little dishes are dunked into the glaze, the water itself is rapidly absorbed into the clay body, leaving a layer of the raw materials on the outside of the pot. The longer you leave them submerged, the thicker the layer of glaze will be, but you can quite easily completely overwhelm the clay. Dunk them for too long, oversaturating them, which results in the glaze flaking and cracking off before you even fire them again. I think it's time we deal with those scruffy bottom edges. They're sharp and rough at this point, but the material, now ceramic, is much stronger, which means I'm going to be able to grind them down on a diamond pad, which I'm going to attach to the wheel on one of these sticky pads, all of which, this sticky pad and the diamond discs, were gifted to me by Diamond Core Tools. I very lightly wet the underside of the rubber pad, as this helps it stick to the metal. In an ideal world, I'd have one of those dripper things above the wheel that release constant drips onto whatever surface beneath them, but I don't have one of those, so I'm just going to have to use a jug of water. So, this is the plan. I'm going to grind each side at roughly 45 degrees, moving it back and forth ever so slightly on the wetted diamond pad. And what a difference that makes. And I didn't have to worry at all about actually destroying the soap dish itself, or chipping it, or cracking it. It's so much easier to do at this stage. So, I've only got to do this 1076 more times, and I'll be finished. It's also at this stage, if one of the dishes had warped a tiny bit and teetered from side to side, I'd simply place it down flat on the disc to grind away whatever irregularity that was causing it to not quite sit flat, just like this. In a way, I knew I might have to do this, and that's why I stamped them quite deeply with my maker's mark, as it meant that even if I did have to grind the bottoms, my signature would still be there impressed into the clay. They feel so much better after this bit of shaping, and again it was repetitive work that I enjoyed, especially with my headphones on, with loud music playing to drown out this scraping sound. Now, the only annoying thing about this process is that it left each dish relatively dusty. In fact, in some cases the dust was really caked on and hard, and I absolutely cannot glaze these until that dust has been removed. As if I did leave it and then I dipped each of these in glaze, they would probably all do something called crawling, which is when the glaze that coats these begins to separate from itself, leaving random patches of bare clay messily across the dishes. In short, it would ruin them. Every single one, if dusty, would be rendered a second or a third, which means this step of thoroughly washing each is crucial for the success of these pieces. I found that one of these wire sponges worked really well, as it doesn't disintegrate after being rubbed over those sharp edges. And this board was honestly twice as heavy as compared to how it was before, after each has absorbed so much water. The next step is waxing the bases of these, and to do this I'm going to be using these wide foam brushes, as not only will it make the process much quicker, but using these I should also be able to wax the beveled section on the underside. I know that you can dip pots into wax to coat their bases, but there's no way that technique can be used in such a way to achieve the level of accuracy I need. Even a regular hairbrush might not work quite as well as this, and it made what was a really daunting task to do to all 270 of these into, you guessed it, another process that I really quite liked. There's something about working with your hands and whittling away the hours whilst listening to an audiobook that I really love. It's peaceful and calming. The work is simple and careful, and there's a huge sense of achievement once every single vessel has reached that next step. And finally, I just dab a touch extra in my maker's mark, just to make sure it's properly sealed, as the last thing I want is to be fussing over them at the end, digging excess glaze out of them with a needle. I then place them upside down and let them dry like this. The next step in the process is the glazing, which, as they are just essentially tiles, is really straightforward. They're simply lowered in and pulled out, but before I can begin using this glaze properly, I need to give it a really thorough mix, as the heavier, raw materials tend to settle to the bottom, leaving a watery film on top, which, if you dipped a pot into this, a thick enough layer wouldn't adhere to it. I grasp the dish tightly with a pair of tongs, lower it in, and then after a few moments, pull it out and move it around so that the excess glaze can drain off. You can see how the wax on the bottom repels the glaze. But this wasn't the only way I glazed these. With others, when I pulled them out, I tried to catch as much glaze as I could on the top surface, so that the glazed effect, once fired, would be more intense. This again is arguably an easy step. It's not so much difficult as it is time consuming, as before I can place each soap dish down, I first have to wait for most of the glaze to dry on it. I then take it with my other hand and then carefully set it down on the wearboard. The other thing that was happening was that the glaze was bunching up on the sides, creating some uneven patches here and there, which I want to avoid, as all that means is that I have to spend more time later tidying each individual piece up. A couple of hours later, and they've all been glazed. And it's what's to come, the cleaning up of each, which I think is going to be the most tedious part of their entire creation. The tongue marks on top have to be tidied up, and on the underside of each there are these specks of glaze that still cling onto the wax, and these have to be removed. And then there's also this line where the glaze meets clay that has to be run over with a sponge to make it as crisp and pristine as possible. I can't let there be any wavering lines of glaze, and any small specks of glaze left on the underside would stick the soap dish to the kiln shelf during the firing. And on top, the tongue marks look a bit like this. The glaze is thicker where the tongs were, so they need to be carved back and made flush with the rest of the surface. The good thing about this glaze is that it's quite strong. It contains quite a lot of clay and bentonite, which means I can carve it quite aggressively with a knife without having to worry about it chipping away too much. So I start by scraping some of the excess off the sides and then running the knife over that chamfered edge. And you'll notice that I try to work over a jug of water. This collects the glaze dust, and eventually, once this project's over, I'll be able to recycle this glaze back into the larger bucket I dipped these into initially. This is one of those steps that's better done carefully and slowly, as the better they look at this point, the more pristine and neat they are, the better they're going to look once fired. And as I've got 270 to get through, it's only natural that my speed will increase as I work through them. I then use a slightly damp sponge to remove any specks of glaze on the bottom and to tidy up the beveled edge like I was telling you about, with my aim being to create an edge that looks like this. That's much better. They don't have to be completely perfect. I don't mind if the glaze is thicker on the edges in some spots, or on the top, as long as the underside is finished to my liking. Slight variances in the glaze's thickness will only create more interest in the finished objects. It took me about 2 days to get through all of them, whilst doing a few other jobs here and there. I found it easiest to use a curved kidney like this to remove the tongue marks on top, as it matched the curvature of the soap dish itself. The only thing I had to be very careful about was not accidentally knocking the glaze off the sharp edges on top, as it chips so easily off these points. And even how I hold the soap dish with my left hand is important. It's held with a really firm grip, as I don't want to let my fingertips rub on the glazed surface, as if you have a loose grip and your fingers rub, it's relatively easy to accidentally create thin patches, which is something you definitely want to avoid as they show in the finished piece, ruining the uniformity of the glaze. Now I know some of you will be asking, why doesn't this soap dish have a hole or a way of holding the soap up above it, say on grooves of some kind, or on additions of clay that keep it held slightly aloft. So the idea is that the curvature of the dish itself will keep the block of soap slightly raised so air can get underneath it. And through testing, and after using one of these for a couple of months now at home, as long as you don't slosh tons of water back onto the dish when you place the soap down, it actually works surprisingly well. Let's move on though. The next step is packing all of these into my gas kiln, and as any of you who have fired tons of flatware before might know, you're essentially firing just as much kiln furniture as you are pots. So I had to use a couple of my thicker, old kiln shelves, which tend to sag and bend at top temperatures, making them rather terrible to actually fire flatware on, as the sagged shape of the kiln shelf means the pots aren't actually firing on a flat surface. And this is precisely why I use these shelves in the lower half of the kiln, as the temperature tends to be a touch lower, and from this point onward I could use my silicon carbide kiln shelves, which are much thinner and lighter, and stay perfectly flat even when fired to top temperature. The truth is I need to invest in more of these, as in theory, as they are half the thickness of the other shelves, you can pack in twice as much work. I have a feeling some of these towards the bottom might underfire, especially as they're packed so densely, but it's fine. If that does happen, I'll just fire them for a second time, which should fix any issues if the glazes are matte, for instance. The soap dishes are great actually for slotting in between bowls in spaces I would otherwise not really be able to use. So perhaps after this commission is finished, I should start making these a bit more regularly, as they really do make great kiln fillers. The following morning at 7 AM, the kiln is lit. There are 4 burners in total, 1 in each corner, and they're put onto the lowest possible setting. For this initial step of igniting the kiln, the door is left swung open, as the last thing you want is for the chamber to be filled with gas and then suddenly ignited, as if enclosed it can cause an explosion. Unlike my electric kiln, which can be fired automatically, this kiln, which is fueled with mains gas, is totally manual, and every single adjustment is done by hand. And with all 4 burners lit, the door can be swung closed and fastened tight. From beginning to end, this entire process takes about 9 hours, and initially the temperature is increased really gradually, as if you fire too quickly, there is a chance that you can blow up the pots inside. You'll hear a few muffled pops, and then a scattering of fragments. It hasn't happened to me in a long time, since college, in fact. It's also for this reason that it's best to let your pots dry out a bit before you fire them, as if you placed lots of freshly glazed, sodden wet pots inside, and then immediately fired them, well, you're just asking for trouble. Every 30 minutes I check the temperature, and if I see that it needs to be increased, I simply allow more gas in on each burner. Also, every 30 minutes I log the time, the hour, the temperature, the gas pressure, the air pressure, and the damper position. Many of these stay the same for much of the firing, but it's always good to keep really good notes, as it makes replicating successful firings very easy, and it lets you know at which rate you need to increase the temperature in order to stay on target. At 860 degrees precisely, I initiate the reduction atmosphere. I do this by increasing the gas pressure, the air pressure, and by sliding the dampers to be half closed. This places the kiln into a state where there's not enough oxygen inside the chamber for the fuel to burn properly. As a result, oxygen is drawn out of the clay and glazes themselves, And it's this chemical change that gives you certain colours and qualities that are really difficult to achieve in an electric kiln. This state of reduction is what causes flames to come out of the kiln, and it's these things, the pyrometric cones, which I can see through spy holes in the kiln's door, that measure something called heat work, which is heat over time, and after all three have bent over, which takes some time, at roughly 1290 degrees Celsius, the kiln can be switched off, the reduction firing finally finished. The kiln itself takes about 2 days to cool down properly, but as the walls are so thick it really does retain that heat well, and just after the firing is over, I remove the bungs from the spy holes, and I also open the damper fully. I let the kiln crash cool back down to 1000 degrees Celsius. This helps to retain colour and keeps the glazes from becoming too matte. Equally, as these glazes contain titanium dioxide, this should prevent too much crystallisation from occurring. And once the kiln is roughly 1000 degrees, I bung up the spy holes and close the damper. And now we have to wait. It's now Monday. It's been 2 days and the kiln has cooled down fully. This means the door can be cracked open and I can finally see what these soap dishes look like. So, as I expected, those towards the bottom front are a bit too matte for my liking, but it's fine, it's an easy fix as I can just refire them. Also, given it's been 2 days, the kiln is still surprisingly hot. I think because all those dishes and the kiln shelves were so densely packed, it really held on to the heat. So I left the kiln door open for about an hour for it to cool down properly. I actually really like some of these that are a bit crystalline, as the surface looks like it's covered in thousands of tiny petals. But on some of them it's too much. They look almost entirely matte, and for some reason it makes the tongue marks really visible, whereas with the piece on the right you just can't see them, and the colour itself is also much nicer. I didn't manage to fit them all in one kiln, which is probably a good thing. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and by firing the kiln another time I was able to save those that I didn't particularly like. This bottom layer of soap dishes was the worst affected, so I think most of these will be going in for a second dose of heat. Spread out like this though, they do look rather good, and it's inspired me, in the future, if I ever need to tile part of my house, I'm doing it myself. This glaze is really peculiar, as depending on the light you're viewing it in, they can either look far more green or far more yellow, but I think this photograph does a good job of showing you the intensity of colour, whereas with my camera they do feel a bit dull. Next, I picked out all the really matte ones so that they can be refired. And then there's just one final step left before these can actually be called finished, and that's sanding their bases to remove all those gritty specks of grog so that the undersides feel lovely and smooth and won't scratch any tabletop they're placed on. Here are those refired soap dishes, which are now far glassier and have this intense yellow tone to them. Some even have these specks of metal on the surface, from tiny fragments of bronze that were in the reclaimed clay I was using to make these. I love these additions, as it really means that no two are the same, which I guess for something that is a limited edition run, makes them a bit more interesting. I ended up sanding them with a 200 grit diamond pad with the top side pressed down into a pad of foam, so those delicate lines weren't damaged. I then dried them roughly with a towel, but I think each piece will need to be polished individually before I send them off to Perfumer H. The unfortunate news, I suppose, is that these have already sold out. The launch of these was kept quiet for a while, so that they were available to people who just walked into the shops or browsed the website. But after announcing them properly, on the 5th of December, they all disappeared in a few minutes. So a tremendous thank you if you did manage to get one. The bottoms of these were already smooth at the leather hard stage, yet as the clay contains grog, which is pre-fired ceramic material, as the clay shrinks and fires, it recedes around these specks of clay, meaning the stoneware goes from being lovely and glassy smooth to really rough again at this stage. That's why this final sanding is really important. I thought I'd also include in this video how I ship them to Perfumer H. First, I give each one a polish to remove any dust marks on them, or fingerprints. Then I cut a whole lot of this paper bubble wrap into strips. They aren't going far, ultimately, but as these pieces do have really delicate edges, I need them to travel safely. So I will be going a bit overboard on the packaging. I then wrap these dishes 2 by 2, back to back, with a thick layer of this paper bubble wrap surrounding them. This is then repeated for every single soap dish, and finally I wrap them in bundles of 10 in a larger sheet of this paper bubble wrap. I compress the wrapped blocks slightly so there's no way they can slide around, and then I wrap them corner to corner, folding in the excess from the sides to cushion the outside. This is how we wrapped most of the pots in Japan during my 6-month apprenticeship, and it really is a great method as you only need one piece of tape to seal it. This is 50 of them, so I just have to repeat this process another 4 times, and then they'll all be on their way to Perfumer H. But of course, I have to show you what the soap itself looks like. It's wrapped beautifully and smells softly of neroli and cardamom, clove, sandalwood and birch tar. And unwrapped, it's this lovely chartreuse colour. It's green on green, and in the right light they look beautiful together, the soap itself held slightly aloft by the curvature of the dish. I hope you've enjoyed this longer video that goes over the repetitive nature of producing work on this scale. I have to say, it's been an exceptionally fun video to narrate and edit, as it's so different from the content I normally put out. And one last thanks to Nigel and Lyn over at Perfumer H for inviting me to take part in this collaboration, and of course to all of you who've made it this far to the end of the video. Thank you so much for taking your precious time to watch. And, as always, I'll see you in the next video.